Well, hello again, and welcome back to the men's class. I would like to welcome everybody who's tuning in, whether you're from the men's class or not. So we're going to jump right into the today's lesson. We're going to do a recap on the book of Genesis. So we came to the end of Genesis in our studies of God's relationship with mankind from the beginning of throughout the world history. I think this book is so important that I think a recap of this book is necessary. So I want to retouch on a few things that we discover as we go through this incredible book. We also need to keep in mind that we only just barely scratched the surface of this book. There's so much more than what we had time to go over. So we're going to look at two big topics that we're going to kind of retouch and recap on. Number one, we're going to look at how God has made knowledge of himself available for mankind throughout all of human history. Number two, we're going to look at how Jesus Christ himself is shown through the scriptures all throughout the book of Genesis. So we're going to recap on those two main subjects. So we'll look at God's relationship with mankind and how he's made knowledge of himself available. We'll look at from Adam to Methuselah first. So Adam lived to tell of his knowledge of God all the way until Lamech. That was Noah's father. Lamech was 56 years old by the time Adam died, because Adam did not die until he was 930 years old. So for 930 years, Adam was able to spread a vast amount of knowledge about God to the world around him, to the people around him for that whole time. We also see that Enoch, when Adam was 622 years old, Enoch was born. And he had a very strong ministry for God, and he taught mankind for over 300 years. He was born, he named his son Methuselah, which means his death will bring. And the worldwide flood did not occur. The world flood did not occur until Methuselah died. So we know that Methuselah's name, when his name means his death will bring, that was talking about the worldwide flood. To testify to the faithfulness of Enoch's walk with God, he was taken by God. He did not die. We see in Genesis 5:24, it says, "And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him." We also see Hebrews 11:5 speaks about Enoch. It says, "By faith Enoch was translated, that he should not see death, and was not found, because God had translated him. For before his translation he had this testimony, that he pleased God." So we look at Methuselah. Methuselah was taught by Enoch, and he had 240 years to learn from Adam himself before Adam died. Methuselah would have been able to hear about the entire history of the world from the beginning by the people who were there at the time. He didn't need to rely on a history book, because everyone who was there during the history that was being created was still alive. He had an amazing opportunity. Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, would have been able to learn from Methuselah. Methuselah was Noah's grandfather. And since Methuselah's life was linked with the flood, and Noah's mission was linked to Methuselah's life, how Noah was building the ark to save all of mankind, to leave a remnant of mankind on the earth, this would have drawn them even closer together. So the relationship between Noah's family, his sons, and Methuselah, they would have learned a lot from Methuselah. Now from Noah to Abraham, Noah was the 10th generation of mankind after the flood. Noah would live to see the 20th generation. So Noah lived 350 years after the flood. So he lived to see the 20th generation of mankind, 10 generations after the flood. And that 20th generation was Abraham. Noah would not die until Abraham was 58 years old. Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth would be able to pass on the knowledge that they had learned from Methuselah for at least 500 years after the flood. Jacob could have learned everything that Methuselah told Shem from Shem up until the time that Jacob was 50 years old. So Shem did not die until Jacob was 50 years old, so he could have passed on everything that Methuselah taught them all the way up to Jacob. Shem died when Jacob was 50 years old. Keep in mind that we do not know when Ham and Japheth died. They may have outlived Shem for all we know, since the generation that lived prior to the flood usually lived into the 800s and 900 years old. Abraham's whole family could have learned from Shem, or possibly even Noah, and who learned everything that they knew from Methuselah. Methuselah would have known everybody that had ever existed from the beginning of the world, and he's the one that taught Noah, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. So the oral tradition about God could not have been corrupted at all by this time for those that kept true to the commandments and the ways of God and resisted their own desires. So if they truly wanted to have a relationship with God, these people were the ones that kept that knowledge of God and would have been able to pass that on. We also have two stories after the flood on how God intervened in the world in a mighty way to remind the nations that He alone is able to judge the world. We have the story of the Tower of Babel. This is when God confused the languages of the world and divided the nations all throughout the earth. This happened while everyone after the flood was still alive. No one had died of old age by the time the Tower of Babel happened, so everybody would have been a witness to this event. Now, we also have the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. This event demonstrated to the world that God would not tolerate a society that has sold itself completely to evil. Now, the judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah was witnessed by the vast majority of the people that had been born after the flood. Most of them were still alive, and they would have been able to see this. Then we see that God begins His covenant with Abraham and his family. God makes a covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is when God began to raise up a nation from the family of Abraham. This family was being raised up in order to proclaim the truths about God to the entire world. They were going to be a nation that would bless all nations of the earth. And that's exactly what God used them for, to bless all the nations of the earth. We see Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all had a profound influence on the lands around them. Abraham became great, and he was widely known in all the lands around him, including Egypt, Canaan, the land of the Philistines, and Syria. Isaac and Jacob had similar impacts on all those lands as well. And then we see by the time of Joseph, he brought the influence of his family to even greater heights as he became the second in command of Egypt, which was the greatest civilization around during this time. By the end of Genesis, this family that God had raised up to bless all nations of the earth had already saved the entire world from famine, and they had risen to one of the most powerful positions in the entire world. And they had great influence by this time. They solely worshiped the one and only true God, and the world knew it. And the world witnessed the love and the might of the one true God. They were already a witness for God to the entire world by the end of Genesis. So now we're going to do a recap on some of the ways that Jesus Christ is shown to us in the book of Genesis. It is very fitting that as we look at God's relationship with mankind throughout history, that we also look at how God reveals Jesus Christ to us time and time again as He shows us His way. Since we know that the whole history of the world will ultimately lead to Jesus Christ and His reign on this earth, it is fitting that He is seen. We know that the world ends with the revelation of Christ and His reign. So it's completely fitting that He shows up all throughout the Scriptures. All throughout God's Word, we see pictures of Jesus Christ. And we see incredible pictures of Jesus Christ in Genesis. So we're going to look at some of those. So in creation itself, in the very beginning, look at Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. So let's look at this verse. Let's break it down a little bit. The word God in this verse is Elohim in Hebrew. That's a plural form of the word God. It means three or more. So we have a plural form of the word God being used here. But what's also interesting is it says God created the heavens and the earth. The word created in the Hebrew language Verbs have singular and plural forms. This word created is in the singular form. So what we have here is we have a plural form of the word God creating the heaven and the earth, but created as a singular form. So we have a 3-in-1 God right off the bat in Genesis 1:1. Also in Genesis 1:26 through 27, we see that when God creates man, he says, "Let us make man in our own image." We see in Genesis 1:26, "And God said, Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. We also notice that again in verse 27, we have the plural form of God being used, the word Elohim. It's a plural form of God. But the verb created, as well as the pronouns he and him that are used to reference God, those are all singular. So again, we have a 3-in-1 God. A God in the plural sense acting as one, as united one God. So we have a 3-in-1 God reference again here in Genesis at the beginning. So in the very first verse and throughout the very first chapter in Genesis, we already have a picture of Jesus Christ working with God. The prophecy of Satan's defeat is mentioned in Genesis chapter 3. We see a picture of Jesus Christ as the one who will come to conquer Satan's hold on mankind. Genesis 3:15, it says, this is after Adam and Eve have been removed from the garden, and God is putting a punishment on the serpent. It says, "And I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel." Now we see a reference to the same serpent in Revelations 20, verse 2. We read in Revelations 20, verse 2, it says, "And he laid hold on that dragon, that old serpent, which is the devil and Satan, and bound him 1,000 years." So we see reference to the serpent as being Satan. So it's widely known that this serpent is a representation of Satan, the adversary of mankind on earth. So in Genesis 3:15, we see that it will be the seed of the woman who will perform this deed against Satan, that will crush the head of Satan. But it's not going to come without a cost. Satan's going to bruise his heel. So there's going to be a sacrifice there. That's also prophesied that the Messiah will be born, but also born of a virgin. We see that it says the seed, the seed always comes from the man and not the woman. But this birth will not be from the seed of a man, but of the woman. This would require a miracle by God for this to happen, and a virgin birth. So here we see that Jesus is being shown to us as victorious over Satan, and we also see how he will be born in Genesis. When Abraham offered up Isaac, we see it's an incredible revelation on how Jesus would offer himself in our place for the sins of the world. In this story, we see that Jesus Christ is the substitute that God provided for mankind, for the sins of all mankind. And we are also shown the exact place where the sacrifice would take place in the future. In the birth of Benjamin, Jacob's son Benjamin, he is born in Bethlehem. This is the first mention of Bethlehem in the Bible, and it directly points towards the birth of Jesus Christ. We see that Jesus Christ himself was born in Bethlehem, and there's prophecies that point to that, and back to this exact point in the Bible, especially with Rachel, and referencing Rachel being buried in Bethlehem. We also see the names that were given to Benjamin. One was, his mother called him Ben-Oni as he was born, because when he was born, his mother died giving birth. Ben-Oni means son of sorrow. But then we see that Jacob changes his name to Benjamin, and that means son of the right hand. And we see both of these names are referencing Jesus Christ. One to his first coming, and when he was a son of sorrow, who bore our griefs and bore our punishment of sin upon himself. And then we see his second coming, Benjamin, son of the right hand, when he comes to reign at the right hand of God. We also see a prophecy of the messianic coming, the messianic line coming from Judah, Jacob's son Judah, when Jacob is blessing his sons before his death. We see in Genesis 49, 8 and 10, it says, Judah, we'll see verse 8 here, it says, Judah, thou art he whom thy brethren shall praise. Thy hand shall be in the neck of thine enemies. Thy father's children shall bow down before thee. Then we see in verse 10, it says, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh come, and unto him shall the gathering of the people be. So we see here the actual line of Jesus Christ is being prophesied, coming from the seed of Judah. And then we see Joseph's story. Joseph's story is told throughout the entire 1/4 of the book of Genesis. The entire last 1/4 of the book of Genesis is dedicated to the story of Joseph. Joseph's life and how it parallels the life of Jesus Christ is like a grand finale at a fireworks display. It just, so much is getting revealed about what the life of Jesus Christ is going to be like through the entire 1/4 of the book of Genesis. As you read the end of the book, it's just time and time again how the life of Christ is being paralleled through this story of Joseph. And what does it show us? It shows us so much of what Jesus Christ would accomplish on this earth, as he would suffer, but he rises, then he saves the world, and eventually reigns on high. So in Genesis, God shows us a full picture of Jesus Christ. We see Jesus Christ as the creator of the universe, with God from the beginning. We see how he will come to earth, where he will be born, how he will be born, what his comings will accomplish. We see that he will be a sacrifice for us as a substitute. We see where the sacrifice is going to take place on Mount Moriah. And we also see that he will come again to reign. There's also a remarkable way that the book of Genesis tells about the end of the world. We are given a clue in Isaiah 46, 9 through 10. Isaiah 46, 9 through 10 reads, Remember the former things of old, for I am God, and there is none else. I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times the things that are not yet done, saying, My counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure. So God says that he tells the end from the beginning, right here in Isaiah. Well, we can read in Revelations chapter 21 and verse 1 what the end looks like. And in Revelations it says, And I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. So what does it look like when God tells the end from the beginning? Well, it would look like Genesis 1 and verse 1, which reads, In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God bless you all, and thanks for listening.